Today's event, much of the public discussion around apprenticeships has been around macro level factors, around funding, around regulatory changes, around the regime as a whole. Most of that narrative has focused around the levy itself and how organisations are going to react, and indeed whether or not it will actually go ahead in the form that it's been proposed. However, today what we want to look at is the next level of decision making. So how are organisations actually preparing for the introduction of the levy, and how does that vary between larger organisations and SMEs? So we're going to look in particular at how approaches to recruitment are evolving and how organisations are looking at selecting delivery partners to make the most of the opportunities that the reforms to apprenticeships provide. So today I'm very pleased to be joined in the room by Gary Tovey, who is Pearson's Head of Employer and Strategic Partnerships. Sian Owen was intending to join us today, but she's been unavoidably called away, so Gary is going to very ably cover for her. But also in the room, I'm very pleased to add, fulfilling a promise that we made at the start of these series, that we would offer a voice to organisations other than Pearson in this series. So fulfilling that promise today, in the room with us is Pippa Morgan, who is the CBI's Head of Education and Skills. Welcome to you, Pippa. So now I believe it is time for me to swap over to our main presenter, Gary.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Neil. So yeah, just extend my welcome from Neil's. Thank you very much for joining us. Just before I sort of set the scene a little bit further and start to go through the rest of the webinar, just for anyone that's new to Pearson or perhaps knows us for one part of what we do, here's just some of our brands that we operate in the UK under. You may know some of these, you may know many of them, you may not know any, but it includes BTEC, which is obviously very well known in the further education sector, and EdExcel, as well as a GCSE and A-level and vocational examination and awarding body. We also do a lot of work with employers with Talent Lens, which is our psychometric testing division, Pearson College, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. Pearson View, many of us know Pearson View or may not know Pearson View. They're the people that actually deliver the driving theory tests. So many of us have probably in the past know someone or have gone through that experience ourselves. And we also have Pearson TQ as well, and you'll see a lot more information on our website regarding them. They're a direct delivery arm that focuses very much on apprenticeships and also the emerging and exciting world of virtual reality, etc. as well. I won't dwell on that. What you're here today really is to get that kind of high-level understanding of where all of the apprenticeship reform is fitting in and focusing the mind really on a few things. First of all, if you are a large employer, what the levy means to you, some of the things you should start to be thinking about or are already thinking about, hopefully, how you prepare for that new world of the apprenticeships, and also really start to think about how you recruit and how you develop people, either new recruits or your internal staff in the future, and use apprenticeships as a really critical tool in which to do that as well. As Neil mentioned, this is the 8th in the series. We have run these for employers previously. I will try and keep this up to date. But there are other webinars on the website, recordings, etc., and slides that go into a lot more detail around things like funding in very specific detail, also around sort of pedagogy and the learner journey around apprenticeships and delivery. And I'm not going to go into sort of the real detail of those today, because each one will be very bespoke to the type of employer you are, the size of employer, and the sector that you operate in. But hopefully we'll cover a good overview. And again, I extend my welcome to Pippa from the CBI. It'd be really good to have a different sort of view on things, or perhaps a similar view but with a slightly different twist, obviously, from the CBI membership. So just to sort of set the scene, the apprenticeship reform that we find ourselves in the midst of, and I think we are still very much in the midst of it, although certain government policies and introduction of additional governance and funding around the levy is probably focusing the mind of the employer at present. But it all kicked off actually with the Richard Review in 2012, and that really looked at the existing apprenticeship model or system called frameworks, and how that could be improved on in terms of employer ownership, in terms of the journey the learner goes on, and also, most importantly, wrapping around that, the quality of the apprenticeship that an apprentice achieves in employment. To do that, trailblazer groups came together. These are effectively employers per sector, and they're designing the new standards and assessment plans, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail in a moment, for particular job roles. And it does fit into a broader kind of government vision around what apprenticeship should look like for 2020, and so the reforms are sort of multifaceted, and that includes changes to how apprenticeships are funded, giving greater employer ownership. There is actually a 3 million target out there that the government's committed to in terms of new starts on apprenticeships, so it's also about a ramping up of activity and greater social mobility through apprenticeships, I suppose. And then lots of sort of tinkering and the sides around, you know, what constitutes an apprenticeship, what doesn't. There's actually a legal term now, for example, and also the introduction of new governance arrangements, again employer-led, to ensure that this new reform, and when that leads to more of a steady state, is both stable, produces quality, and has the outcomes that the Richard Review, I guess, ultimately wanted. And there's also a key component of that, which is the apprenticeship service, which I'll come on to again, which is where employers have that absolute ownership of how funding and delivery come together. I appreciate this is probably frustrating if you're a UK-wide employer, but actually the reforms in terms of trailblazers or standards that I'm going to talk about today do only apply to England. The levy, however, does apply to all UK employers, but there's lots still to be worked out, I think, in the broader skills strategies of the other devolved nations in the UK of how that will actually work. And Pippa, you might have a view on that you'd like to share later on. So I've mentioned employer-led, and I will continue to throughout this afternoon, really, but it's absolutely there across the whole journey of the new apprenticeship standards. So employers, large and small, are there designing standards, two-page job descriptions, occupational briefs, if you like, of what a skill in a particular sector, in a particular job role, looks like now and for the future. There's a whole process there that's listed about how that then gets signed off, because of course these are qualifications and they do need to have a certain rigour to them and consistency across sectors, etc. Employers are also in the driving seat when it comes to delivery. They choose who will be providing their training element. They do have the option to do that themselves, and again I'll come on to that later, and they also choose who will be their apprenticeship assessment organisation as well, and again that will become a bit clearer when I sort of start to dissect how apprenticeships will be delivered. And importantly, the role of government or its agencies in how apprenticeships are funding is changing significantly, and particularly driven by the levy. But again, employers will have that procurement decision, and that's a kind of corporate kind of bit of terminology, but it's an important one actually, because it's very far removed from the current system in terms of government-led or government-owned as well. There'll be different levels of engagement in terms of whether you are a levy payer or a small or medium business, but that engagement and that buy-in is slightly led, obviously, by the contributions that employers will now make, and hopefully that will drive your own sense of ownership of apprenticeships moving forward. There's also the need to transist for existing apprenticeship employers. So many employers across the UK, but again, just to kind of hone in on England, are involved with apprenticeship delivery at the moment, and that's absolutely fantastic. The ambition is obviously that more employers do that, but we understand that if you are already delivering apprenticeships, there is a whole kind of mindset change and process change and methodology change as well. But of course, it represents a huge opportunity for employers who perhaps haven't delivered apprenticeships before to really start to understand the value that they can bring in both your entry kind of talent acquisition, but also your reskill and upskill of your existing workforce as well. And it would be wrong not to mention something called the Sainsbury Review, which is another piece of educational reform that we're not going to really touch on today, but again, just to mention, that is going to be employer-led again, so that's looking at very much the full-time provision in FE colleges, but how those FE colleges can engage a lot more with business and make sure that what learners in FE are coming out with is the right skills for now and the future. So that theme, I guess, of that employer-led continues now across other reforms, and I think that can only be, whilst that will be challenging, it can only be welcomed in terms of trying to join some of those dots and making sure that employers have the right people for the right jobs moving forward. So there's a number of considerations you might want to think about, whether you're already delivering apprenticeships or whether this is relatively new to you. One of the biggest things for me is that responsibility you have when you're delivering apprenticeships as an employer. Yes, all of that employer-led stuff, yes, that procurement, that ownership piece, but actually delivering apprenticeships isn't just delivering your existing business as usual learning and development programs and rebadging it. There is a whole other piece there around pastoral care, around support, around developing people differently, around English and maths, for example. So it is a much broader program and piece of learning and development than sort of bite-size, health and safety, first aid, whatever, or induction or whatever. It's a broad learning program. It gets broader the deeper it goes in terms of levels and in terms of the sort of higher up the job role goes, and that's something really important to consider. But of course, the flip side of that is that if you are going to be paying the levy, then actually, what is the impact on your business as usual? What is the impact on your talent programs, and what is the impact on your graduate programs? So I put this up here really as considerations, perhaps to go back to the business with, in terms of actually you may have different sort of entry streams or existing development programs. There is, if you're paying the levy, that is a significant bit of money to pay, to be frank, and actually does that have either positive connotations or maybe some more negative connotations on your existing programs. Apprenticeships have, perhaps rightly or wrongly, always been sort of tagged along with young people, and actually more than ever apprenticeships are now for all ages, particularly when you look at apprenticeships could go from level 2 entry qualifications as apprenticeships all the way through to degree apprenticeships, and I think there is still much work to be done, and Pippa and I were discussing it with a group of employers only last week. There's much to be done to help the market understand what apprenticeships mean now, but actually they're really great development programs across the age spectrum and across levels of seniority or different job roles as well. There are some unintended consequences of delivery that you might want to think about as well. So one of the options I'll talk about in terms of how you could deliver apprenticeships in the future is being an employer provider, i.e. you deliver the apprenticeships in-house. Now that has some really good, exciting stuff in terms of whole ownership of your program. You can really hone that, but there are some unintended consequences of that, particularly around inspection, for example. So Ofsted operates in this space, and so when I come onto those partnership models later, I've offered some suggestions of other routes that might perhaps allow you to concentrate on the day job whilst also offering apprenticeships as well, without perhaps some of the perceived bureaucracy that might come with that. There's a huge piece of work around engaging with the apprenticeship service, so this online bank account, if you will, and again I'll come on to that, but if that's not on your radar, it's kind of a needs to be frank now, particularly with the levy coming in. You should be accessing that account now to start to understand what that looks like, who in your business, is that finance, is that HR, is that training, who's going to manage that, who's going to ensure you're getting the return on investment through your apprenticeship levy. And we have the Institute for Apprenticeships, which kicks off next month. Huge expectations on that organisation. They are the employer-led body that is going to oversee this new system, this steady state of apprenticeship standards. As I say, employer-led, many employers on their board, on their different committees in terms of looking at different sectors. But actually, I would encourage, if it's not yourself, then certainly senior leaders in the business to try and engage with that institute once it is there, of course, to ensure that your voice is heard for your respective business or indeed sector. And it's that whole relationship piece as well. So my background, I've sat in an L&D department in a large retailer before. We own the apprenticeships. We were left fairly well alone. if you're paying the levy, you've got not just the HRD looking over your shoulder, you've also got the finance director, and I think that changes the dynamic considerably in terms of all the other considerations on this page and everything we talk about as well, and actually how you go about delivering apprenticeships as well. So again, something to think about. And of course, finally, perhaps wrongly finally, is around the valid learning experience. What do your employees, and let's badge them as learners for a moment, what does the learner get out of their apprenticeship program? Is it a valid experience, and is it a worthwhile experience? And will it not just add value to them as your employees, will it in fact add value to them as an employee as well? So this next slide just sort of tries to demonstrate the progression routes that are available, and I think that's again a really important sort of social mobility aspect to apprenticeships. It links into my previous comment around age spectrum, but you can see there that there is now a whole sort of progression pathway from traineeships, which are kind of pre-apprenticeship programs, all the way up to degree apprenticeships as well. And actually they kind of link either side to the academic space, be that GCSEs, A-levels, or more traditional degrees as well. And certainly for us here at Pearson, we operate across that space, and so it's an area that we're really, really familiar with. But the new bit, I think, around that kind of talent acquisition and development is also you're upskilling your existing workforce, so long as there is value add to that, including specialist functions using new multiple standards. So by that I mean the frameworks that are being replaced were relatively generic, the standards that are being developed by employers are now very job specific, and actually there's some really emerging skills gaps and talent areas that you might want to use apprenticeships to plug, you know, IT, finance, HR, business admin, whatever. You know, there's some real great progression opportunities there using the apprenticeship route. But of course, it's also about getting a return of your investment, particularly if you're a levy payer. So it's around looking at what your current programs are, not rebadging them, and that's a really kind of clear message I want to get across. But also, but allowing you to bring that new talent into your business, but also upskill through programs such as a Chartered Manager Degree Apprenticeship, for example, which Pearson College offers. So for us, I guess it's about apprenticeships forming part of that core strategy, that learning and development strategy, and ensuring that progression that I've talked about as well. And we and other organisations are here to really help your in-house learning development HR teams to develop those long-term strategies, particularly if apprenticeships are something new as well, and to kind of start ticking those boxes for your FD in terms of what's that return of investment. Apprenticeships already deliver a number of the things that are in that blue box now. It is anticipated that through this reform and through that greater employer ownership and more honed skills, that can only improve more and more. And this little diagram, which I love because I remember the first time I drew it with a felt tip pen and handed it to Neil and said, do something with that, this is the mind of Gary, is trying to, I guess, show visually what I've been talking about thus far, really, of how apprenticeships can absolutely be the centre of your talent cycle. Yes, you've got that new entrant, new staff kind of area. You've got that higher in degree work-ready graduates, but actually that might be through your existing workforce as well. Imagine the benefit they bring in terms of knowing your business already. That entry route into apprenticeships through traineeships if people aren't quite ready for an apprenticeship. New staff in terms of if people actually enter your business with a certain level of experience, and that might be on their CV and they might be able to demonstrate that, but you might want to even upskill management coming into your business as well. And then for that broader existing staff area, it's around how that supports your existing learning and development, but also how it supports some of those key programs that I know many of you will have around future management and leaders, stretching people, and upskilling in the way that I've spoken about as well. There's also an important element of how during the apprenticeship program there's recognition and ensuring achievement. So it's the key thing about this reform is apprenticeships really is the qualification. So in the past, qualifications have made up apprenticeships and they've almost become more important than the apprenticeship itself. I think that's absolutely flipped on its head now moving forward. So the apprenticeship that the individual gains is the absolute qualification that they get. However, Some apprenticeship standards do include mandatory qualifications. They can't be ignored, and they will have a certain currency within that, despite what I say. A number of organisations such as ourselves are also looking at how existing regulated qualifications could support employers, training providers and FE colleges deliver these new apprenticeship standards as well. There are some technicalities around how those are funded, etc. But generally, we're looking at making sure that any achievement is recognised, so that if people step off or take career breaks or whatever, that there's some of that. But you can also look at other options. Again, we'd be more than happy to talk to you in more detail around that, where we assure training. So we look at employers' training and we quality assure that in effect, so that there's that consistency and external recognition of what's being delivered against an apprenticeship. There's digital badging. That's an area that we're doing a lot of work in at the moment, where learners achieve certain modules or whole programs or schemes of work, and they gain a digital badge. And I'm probably just starting to get too old for digital badging, but I'm told that the millennials love it. So it's a really interesting area, and one that seems to really sort of excite people in terms of then being able to demonstrate their transferability and also their achievement in their employer as well. And also we're launching very soon something called Pearson 360, which is our online digital platform, which will help facilitate the whole learner journey of the new apprenticeship standards. And I'm going to come on to that learner journey very shortly. And again, more information is on our website about that, but that's digital content to ensure that, again, it's not sort of textbook or folders of work. It's something that's live and really engaging for apprentices. So what's changing? The learning model is changing in terms of what an apprenticeship contains and what the outcome is. So that is very much going to be defined on a standard by standard basis, because each standard is different to each job role as well. I've talked about that increased employer involvement in terms of how they are designed. We've got a lot of change happening around the institution who administers apprenticeships, how apprentices and employers are matched, certification and quality assurance, and a lot of that is going to be dealt with by the Institute for Apprenticeships or through its partners, such as the Skills Funding Agency. But again, lots of things to get your head around if you're new, some changes if apprenticeships aren't so new to you as well. And then under funding, who pays? The funding levels, so apprenticeships in general terms are going to be better funded. If you're a levy payer, you might not feel that because it's coming out of your levy pot, but in terms of the value that each apprenticeship has attached to it, it's significantly higher generally than we've seen before. The mechanisms are changing, and the mechanism changes depending on whether you're a large or small employer. And so my final wrap up in terms of what's changing, just to kind of explain that learner journey. On the left-hand side there in the blue, you can see the current frameworks, which are dying a slow, painful death, I think it's fair to say. They will, according to government, be replaced by around 2020, and all apprenticeships will be on these new standards designed by employers. The learner journey differs somewhat. So whereas for frameworks there was almost a whole ownership by the employer, provider or college, now that's kind of segmented. So if you have an apprentice in your business, in simple terms, you will have an element of on-the-job, off-the-job training, what we call on-program learning, where the apprentice learns the job, learns their skill, their craft, their key knowledge, skills and behaviours. There's then a gateway element that the employer and provider sit down and ensure that the learner is ready to go to endpoint assessment. And then there's this endpoint assessment, which is wholly independent, delivered by separate organisations that haven't been involved with on-program delivery, called apprenticeship assessment organisations, and then the employers define what that endpoint assessment looks like. Sounds a bit confusing. Let me give you a great analogy. It's a bit like learning to drive. So your on-the-job, off-the-job training is a bit like being in the car with your driving instructor. You learn your key skills and behaviours, and in the case of apprenticeships, also your knowledge as well. You then have your gateway, which is a bit like your driving theory test. So it's independent of your driving instructor, and it assesses whether you are ready to, yes, have the theory, but effectively move on to have your driving test. And then you have endpoint assessment, in in the apprenticeship world, which is a bit like your driving test, wholly independent, with someone that you've not met before who assesses you across a series of key kind of criteria to ensure that you can drive. Kind of a good analogy. I get either really good or really bad at giving it, but I think hopefully that helps in terms of trying to understand where those different, I guess, demarcations of learning, gateway and independent endpoint assessment work. Overall then, once the apprentice is finished, that organisation that has endpoint assessed them effectively will claim the certificate, the apprenticeship certificate, on your behalf, on behalf of the employer, and then that's the apprenticeship complete in its simplest form. So on to the money. The levy. So the levy starts from next month. There's lots of information there. Hopefully you are aware of most of that. I'm not going to go into sort of all the calculations, etc. But importantly, it applies to all employers across the UK, but then it at the moment can only be used to fund apprenticeships in England. Government does top up your levy account by 10%, and you do have 24 months to spend whatever's taken by HMRC through PAYE as well. The government is considering allowing employers to transfer 10% of their unused funds to employers in their supply chain from 2018. I believe that's quite ambitious because unfortunately much of your supply chain is likely to be in the SME sector, and they're not quite using the same systems as the levy payers around the same timescales. So I think that is a great ambition. We wait and see whether that can be truly realised as well. Ultimately, there'll be this digital account, this apprenticeship service, so levy payers should be starting to sort of log on, register on that now. SMEs will come along, I think broadly they're saying between 2018 and 2020. Idea is though that overall by 2020 employers should have access to a digital account and be able to take greater ownership of their funding. But the levy is a fundamental, game-changing and behavioural changing tool, both from government but also to be used by employers. So if I put that in a bit more of a simple way, this sort of shows you how the funding will flow. So frameworks and standards, because frameworks, as I said, are still dying that slow death, are now going to be funded the same way. So you will see frameworks start to disappear and standards sort of start to rise in terms of the different programs. So if you're a non-levy payer, just to touch on it quickly, an SME effectively, you will be paying an employer contribution, which is 10%, and the government will pay 90% of your funding. There are some anomalies in there, but that's more around age of the apprentice and the size of your business, etc. And as I say, you will use the apprenticeship service ultimately, but currently that will be contracted through a provider. A levy payer will use the apprenticeship service. Their levy amount will go straight in there, plus their 10% top up from the government, and that's how you manage that as well. Okay. And then just to sort of go into those contributions a bit more, for non-levy payers, as I said, 10% mandatory employer contribution. That is different from where we are currently, and the government will contribute 90%, and there's some other anomalies there that I mentioned as well. If you're a levy payer, it goes straight into your digital apprenticeship account. Government tops that up by 10%, and if, depending on the size of your levy pot, you are able to spend that, you then revert actually to that non-levy model above. I hear mixed feelings from levy payers. Some levy payers are saying, hey, it's a tax, we're going to leave it. Some are saying we're going to do our utmost. Some are desperate to spend their levy and then move to the model that you can see at the top there. So real mix, and I think my message from there is actually one size does not fit all, and it will be up to your own business and your own strategy in terms of how you actually want to deliver that.
Okay, Gary, just going to come in with a couple of questions there. So on funding, a questioner who I can see works for a logistics organisation who I presume are UK-wide is asking about the impact of these reforms on the other nations in the UK. So is it, can you summarise, because I know this will be a technical question, but can you summarise the impact that this is going to have on truly national organisations in the UK? Does this effectively mean that there are going to be 2, 3, even 4 recruitment and development strategies in those organisations?
Yeah, I suppose the painful answer is yes. There is going to be an apprenticeship system in England driven by levy funds if you're a large employer, or the 90-10 model if you're an SME. The current Welsh apprenticeship frameworks continue. I know that the Welsh Government is looking at how they will reform them themselves. Whether they will align to English standards or not is not clear yet. Scotland has its own modern apprenticeship programmes. Again, very different to the English model, and the same for Northern Ireland as well. And whilst there's still this question around, or whilst levy monies can only be spent on apprenticeships in England, even if they're collected from a UK-wide organisation, I think that's going to continue to be a challenge, because we're not wholly clear yet what those devolved governments are going to do with the money they get from the levy, which they will get, because there's a Barnett formula there in terms of the way monies, all taxes are split across the 4 nations, but that's not clear yet. So the honest answer is yes, it will be a challenge for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thanks. So just to summarise, because obviously you're saying that there's still a little bit of detail to emerge on this. Other than ourselves, obviously, we will have more information as and when it's available. Who should employers be keeping tuned to in order to find out how that's going to work?
So I think it's 2 organisations. First of all, it's a skills funding agency, because they set the funding rules, i.e. what can the money be spent on. Only this week they have started to tighten up their guidance, because there has been examples, dare I say quite rightly, where employers have explored trying to use their English levy money to pay for provision in the other nations, and I think that's getting nipped in the bud a little bit. But also the one to watch once it's here is the Institute, because they're being very clear that they are discussing with the devolved nations how this will all work in the future, and are committing to having that dialogue with Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as well.
Okay, thanks very much. And change the subject slightly. So we've got a question around assessment and independence of assessment. So different organisations are making different promises, and some are saying that they're on registers, some are saying they're applying for registers, and there seem to be different definitions of independence floating around. So has it actually been definitively qualified yet how independent from the trainers and assessors who deliver on programme assessment and material have to be from the endpoint assessment? Is a distinction between departments sufficient, or must there be a legal definition? Must there be a company distinction? What's the final verdict on that?
Okay, so as you know, last week we did an endpoint assessment webinar, which we went into a lot of detail around this. As i.e., I'm not escaping the question. Yeah, absolutely. It's not an easy answer, so let me try and make it so. Independence is quite clear in government's policy, particularly the Skills Funding Agency, although I think it is still open for interpretation, which is not ideal. So we're all having to operate kind of under that space, I guess, for want of a better word. We're quite clear in terms of what we interpret independence as, because we have spent a lot of time having direct dialogue as one of those apprenticeship assessment organisations that is offering endpoint assessment. We've had that direct dialogue with the Skills Funding Agency, the Department for Education and the Institute for Apprenticeship shadow team of what constitutes. I think broadly the idea of I've assessed someone and I then want to endpoint assess them, we know that's not independent. The SFA and DFE are more leaning towards a very clear demarcation between on-programme and endpoint assessment that could potentially include separate legal entities, and that's particularly where they're pushing us. So where we're looking at partnerships with training providers, for example, we are saying that if we have a partnership and use some of your assessors to offer or provide endpoint assessment on behalf of Pearson as the endpoint assessment organisation, then those assessors will actually sit in a separate legal part of your business. There are exceptions to that, so there are some standards where the Trailblazer Employer Group has managed to get dispensation to allow for employers, their employees to support endpoint assessment where there's very specialist skills. So, for example, smart metering, we've recently announced a partnership with British Gas. Some of those trainers in British Gas as an employer will also support us with endpoint assessment, but that's because the skill set needed is very specific, and that is a dispensation that has to be signed off by the Department for Education. That's not a decision that any of us more in that kind of delivery assessment space can make. So we are certainly ploughing ahead with our interpretation of independence, which is firstly and foremost, no crossover between on-program and endpoint assessment, so therefore our partnerships and collaborations and consortia or our direct recruitment is generally going along those lines of, it will be someone from either a separate organisation or certainly from a separate legal entity.
Okay, and another question come back in, a follow-up to that independence question. So can employers actually deliver the EPA themselves? This is something that some of them are interested in doing. So is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And apologies, I'm not quite sure where, I might not have this on my slides, but there are two registers effectively, and I do cover this when I talk about employer provider. There's a register for apprenticeship training providers, ROTAP. On that, employers can actually apply to go on that and deliver that on program, that training element, effectively as a training provider, but the training provider to themselves. There's a separate register called the Register of Apprenticeship Assessment Organisations, which is where the endpoint assessment organisations apply to. There are a number of employers, only a handful though, not even that have gone on to that to offer endpoint assessment. The problem is there's still challenges around that interpretation of independence. So would it's difficult without mentioning employer. I'm going to use the CBI. Would the CBI, how they logistically become deliver their training, but also become an endpoint assessment? That is a real kind of unintended consequences, to use my phrase from before. And also, becoming an endpoint assessment organisation, I would encourage employers to have a conversation with us, have a conversation with other organisations that have been successful on that particular register, and we're more than happy to share with you our experience of how we've had to demonstrate our capability and capacity, both in terms of resource and assessment skills as well. So it is a huge, it is a very different operation to business as usual, irrespective of what employer you are and what sector you are in. It's quite a specialist operation that you effectively be setting up as part of your own business.
And another follow-up question, is it possible for employers to get involved as subcontractors to registered endpoint assessment organisations where, for example, they are providing assessment in a particular specialism? So say there was a particularly technical assessment for a particular standard, could an expert organisation in that area provide the assessors to the apprentice assessment organisation?
The easy answer is yes. The more difficult answer is what the contractual arrangements look like for that. And I only mention that, it sounds like I'm coming down a bit heavy, I'm not. It's just that if you are the endpoint assessment organisation, such as we are and a number of our competitors, you remain wholly accountable for the quality and independence of that endpoint assessment. So therefore, there are important contractual and partnership arrangements needed, if that was the case, to ensure that we are all meeting that overall accountability.
But the answer in principle is
yes. The answer is yes. Okay, thanks, Neil. Which leads beautifully on to the partnership options. So there are a number of options you might want to consider. I'm not going to tell you which one's the best. It's up to you. It's up to your business. But again, we're always here to advise and give you, that different picture depending on the route you wish to take. So one of the options is to work with an education provider such as ourselves to provide you with advice, guidance, support across that whole journey of on-program gateway and endpoint assessment. And we're doing a lot in that space, and again, when I hand back to Neil at the end, he'll talk to you about some of the resources that we're already starting to produce to support employers specifically. When it comes to delivery, you could look at working, if you're not so already, with a private training provider or FE college to deliver that on-program element, or you might wish to, as I kind of covered off, sorry, by my explanations of the different registers, actually becoming an employer provider and doing that direct delivery yourself. There are a number of employers that do direct delivery already. Again, I would say that is, and I imagine they will continue to do so. But but it won't look the same as it does currently delivering frameworks. And of course, remember those unintended consequences as well, Ofsted being one example. And then looking at your endpoint assessment. And again, because of that independence that we've just talked about, employers in the driving seat, employers will use that register of apprenticeship assessment organisations to procure the organisation they wish to use to do their endpoint assessment. And as we all start to define and publish what our offer is by standard, and bear in mind there's a proliferation of standards, Neil has the number I think, but actually, you know, endpoint assessment offers are coming in or being developed and released at different stages as well. So I appreciate that makes the procurement decision quite difficult if you wanted to sort of go big bang across a number of different apprenticeships. But again, have a conversation with us, have a conversations with others, and we're able to roadmap that out for you. So before I kind of just sum up on a few bits, the most important part of the day is over to Pippa. So again, thank you, Pippa. So we were really keen to ensure that we had a different voice, I suppose, than just, well, certainly just my own, but also from outside of Pearson to talk really about the apprenticeship reform and most importantly what it means to you as employers. So thanks again for joining us, Pippa. I know I've got a few questions to ask you, but I didn't know if you just wanted to introduce yourself and say why you're here and why it's important, I guess, for CBI.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for inviting me, Gary. So just by way of introduction, I'm Pippa. I head up the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry's Education and Skills Team. In short, we are UK's top lobbying organisation, which means that we work with businesses and government about how you get a sort of prosperous and successful UK, and in particular in my area, what education and skills policy needs to look like so we can give people a really great education, address skills gaps and help people build careers. So given all of that, actually apprenticeships and the reforms that you've been talking about this afternoon, Gary, I've been taking up a lot of my time and my team's time over the last year and a half, and I'm sure that's true of everyone who's listening in today. I think we hear from businesses and we work with companies of all sizes, of all sector across the 4 nations of the UK. We hear 2 things, which is they struggle to fill vacancies, so around a quarter of vacancies in the UK are classed as hard to fill. That's about 200,000 jobs, and work is changing in terms of what a career looks like and in terms of what technology and digitisation means. And that actually means that apprenticeships are a really, really important part of a lot of companies' talent and development strategies, because they give people an opportunity to learn on the job. They give, which is a win-win for both a learner and a business. They give companies the opportunity to tailor training in the way that suits them. You've been talking about the standards, and it gives people an opportunity. They might have GCSEs, maybe they have a BTEC or A levels, or even a degree, but actually it's an opportunity to learn and earn, whether that's because you've had a bit of a change of heart at 21 or actually at 42 or later when it's time to make a career move. So the companies that we speak to are hugely enthusiastic about apprenticeships, and whether that's that they currently have programs or that it's something they're thinking about developing.
And of course it's National Apprenticeship Week, so
It
very timely.
It is. Yes, very fitting discussion.
Okay, yeah. So I've just got a few questions, if that's okay, and hopefully those listening will find sort of hopefully your answers are useful. So we've got a month until the levy. It feels like it's been a long time coming, but it's finally here. And some of that major sort of parts of the reform take effect that I've talked about in terms of the apprenticeship service and the institute, etc. What's your sense of the mood amongst businesses?
So I would say it really varies. That companies are at really different stages, and that'll apply across everyone who's listening today. Some of you might be using today to check your understanding. Others of you might be feeling a little bit behind the curve because actually there's been a fair number of other policy changes that if you're in HR or in the finance team, you've been dealing with, whether that's gender pay regulations, the national living wage, or things like that. So there's a real variety of kind of business readiness. People want it to work and to get it right. There's a concern because timescales have been so tight that when the government has given information, and you talked about things like the Register of Apprenticeship Training Providers, well, that's not published yet. So people will be paying in a month's time, but they don't yet know who's an approved training provider. The timescales don't match business planning, and that's led to, I think it would be fair to say, quite a degree of frustration, whether that's about the difficulty getting information and understanding what is a very technical and complex system, and for a lot of businesses it's something that they are encountering for the first time.
And we talked about the opportunities today, because I think there are, yes, absolutely. There are frustrations, yes, there's a lot to get our heads around, but there's also a number of opportunities through the new standards. What sort of opportunities are most frequently cited by CPI members?
So you're right, yep, they are opportunities. I'd point to three things. A lot of companies are using it as the levy and apprenticeship reforms as an opportunity to look again at their training and career routes. You talked about that, and your sort of the stepping stone graph that you had, I think, illustrates it really, really well. That businesses want to help their employees progress, and actually this is in a lot of cases prompted a fresh look that companies can offer from level 2 to 7 now. Actually, there's a way of supporting people through a career and skill route. Opportunity to start or expand apprenticeship programs. So you talk to a lot of HR teams, they want to do this, they've been waiting for it, they've been wanting to do so for a while, and the levies nudge them over. Often people are looking to expand into other areas of the business. Maybe they're an engineering company and they've always had them on the kind of engineering and manufacturing side, but actually they're looking at legal, at financial, or some of the more kind of back office functions. And I think lastly, it's the opportunity to design the training that people need. And if you take a look at the standards that are currently available or in development, which is a big part of your job, and I'm sure many of those listening, it just gives you a snapshot of how vibrant the UK economy is. You can do everything from tunnelling to bespoke tailoring to sea fishing, which is my new favourite one.
Mine's golf greenkeeping, yeah.
Golf greenkeeping.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Oh, there's just so many of them that I want to do. That reflects the fact that businesses are saying, we need these skills. Okay, we're going to get stuck in and we're going to design what we need.
So they're the opportunities.
Yeah.
What are the challenges? What's keeping people awake at night in terms of your membership, I guess?
I think there are a few things, and I'd probably divide them into two categories. You've got issues around talent and issues around the process, if I can think about it in that way. On the kind of on the talent side, looking again at training and career routes, you alluded to it before that there's an increasing kind of financial aspect to the decisions that people are making. The levy does have some perverse and difficult incentives in it. It's been designed to work for government and to replace funding that government used to have. It is a tax which has had a skills system designed around it, and what we know is that for many to meet their levy obligations, and the fact that they won't be able to spend all of it, means people are reluctantly looking at cutting back on other training. Sort of linked to that, actually, people might be changing their apprenticeship programs, and the difficulties, as I mentioned, around the timescales are making it difficult for people to scale up or create provision. So often years 1 and 2 just aren't going to, be what a business would want them to be in terms of both the scale of the sort of cost that they are paying in the levy and what they would want ready for their employees. Actually, one of the biggest frustrations is that they want a really good offer because it's a competitive marketplace for apprentices. And lastly, while they get a chance to design the training that they need through standards, you and many listening will know that the standards process can be a bit opaque and a bit slow, and at odds with it often doesn't quite feel like the business-led process it's claimed to be. I think that's on the kind of talent and people side. Two things I touch on the process side, and it's probably very close to many people listening's hearts, which is one, that the kind of business planning cycle. People are, it's not as simple as just, well, we'll just move we'll just skip the intake for this year, or we'll just adjust that. there are companies who report quarterly for whom the levy is, going to be a huge, it's going to make a huge difference to what they're saying for that. And linked to that, there's also a kind of internal process issue, which actually there'll be many of you listening who might have just started or be in the process of registering for your apprenticeship service account. Is that something that's going to be held by HR? Is it something that's going to be held by finance? Have your HR, finance and tax teams sat down in the same room? Or maybe you don't have teams, but they're all one person. And actually, the process of businesses kind of preparing and getting ready for that, I think we've seen amongst our members prompt some real kind of challenges.
Thank you. Really, no, but I think it's good to view, it's not just a positive story, there are some challenges as well, so that's really useful. Thank you, Pippa. I'm conscious of time. Pippa's going to stay for questions. We always try to kind of finish on time and then allow a little bit of time for questions. So thank you. We'll probably hear from you again shortly. I'm just going to quickly wrap up with a couple of slides and then hand back to Neil, really. So if we had more time, I'd probably give a little bit more detail on this, but just thinking about that kind of innovation in apprenticeships in terms of not just doing, the sort of bog standard stuff that perhaps everyone's talking about. One of the things you might want to just have a look at the Pearson College website. They've launched something called the Rotational Degree Apprenticeship. I'm really excited by this because it's around an apprentice coming into a given business, and you'll see the businesses we're working with, and actually then rotating around them and gaining amazing skills across those different businesses and gaining a degree as well. Sorry I can't do that justice today, but I just wanted to highlight that because I'm really excited about that. Of course, we are also a levy payer. We probably should have mentioned that right at the beginning. So we are going through this same process and transition as you are. Myself and my colleague will be actually interviewing for an apprentice in our team only next week, and really looking forward to that as well. But we work across employers, and there's just a few examples there across sectors, and so therefore, come and have a chat with us if you like to, and we're always here to help as well. And I guess leading on to that, my last slide before I hand over to Neil is just around the ways that we can help, around the reform, around understanding how that governance is changing, what's important to your business, and that kind of little wink across the fence to the skills plan and perhaps the impact that will have on your talent acquisition moving forward. I will hand over to Neil now.
Okay, so just to wrap up, before we go, people often ask, will you send the slides out to us after these events? The answer to that is obviously yes, we will. What we'll also email to you is some material that's been designed very much for employers who are coming in at the very start and know little about apprenticeships. Hopefully, having listened to this webinar, you wouldn't be among those, but hopefully the Employer's Guide to Apprenticeships that we will send you a link to as soon as this session is over should help you perhaps improve the knowledge of some of your colleagues, shall we say, and enlighten them as to some of the angles that apprenticeships can be viewed from. We've got case studies in there from everyone from ASDA through to Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and some case studies of how to use apprenticeships for everything from the typical occupations that you would associate apprenticeships with, all the way through to customised higher national qualifications and, as Gareth says, rotational degree apprenticeships, things that you wouldn't necessarily think could be useful, you could use apprenticeships for. Before we go any further, I'd just like to, these slides will be sent out to you a little bit later, and these will have the live links in, but some of the ways that you can keep in touch with us, and one of the things that we promise to do is to keep you updated on the development of the levy reforms as we go. So Twitter, we're at Pearson APPR. You can also find us on LinkedIn. We have a newsletter. We're creating an employer-specific version of that, and the first version of that should be ready within the next month or so. That's called Insight. You can find a link to that on our websites, quals.pearson.com/apprenticeships. There you'll find a link through to our blog, and just listening into this session, I've thought of another couple of articles that we could potentially add to that and expand on some of the points that we've seen here. And you can also find a link there to our future Insight webinars and future sessions upcoming. I can say that based on the quality of the content today, Pippa may well find herself being invited back to some of them. You can also, we've had a couple of questions about funding. We have a colleague, Sian Owen, who is a specialist in such things. She writes an absolutely, I would say, an absolute lifeline for people like myself who are not technical with funding at all. It's called Funding Focus. You can sign up to get that direct into your inbox, and I would imagine that the content of that is going to change quite radically over the next couple of months as the whole landscape around funding starts to change and we start to transition from one system to the other. And Gary will probably poke me with a sharp stick if I don't mention his handy guides that he writes. There are a series of them on all kinds of topics relating to vocational education. They are also on our Pearson UK website. So at this point, that is all of our scheduled content for today. We're going to hang around to take any questions that there may be coming in from you. You can use the chat window to do that between now and the time that we log off.